Well, hello and welcome to an Angling Direct Learn to Fish. And today I've made the journey to the tidal river Trent, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight on how I target barbel in big, powerful rivers like this. So the first thing I want to talk about is location, and the reason I mention that first is I've walked poor Amanda all the way along the river, quite a long walk, to get to a nice big sweep and bend. And the reason I've chose this bend is what I can best describe as all the lively water is under my own feet. And what I mean by that, I've got a nice gravel run, nice deep water and a big crease on my own bank. And if you can get those barbel feeding on your own bank on these big rivers, it's so much easier to bait up, it's so much easier to keep casting accurate, and it just makes the job of catching fish a lot better if you're not trying to cast big heavy feeders to the far side of the river. So the first thing I'm going to do before I even get the fishing rods out, a really important job, we're going to get some bait in the swim using a bait dropper, and I'll show you that next. Well, I've just mixed up a bucket of bait, a mixture of 4 and 6 mil krill pellets, some hempseed, some 12 mil krill active boilies, and a little bit of krill glug as well. So a really barbely mix there. And the way to get it straight down to the bottom in these fast flowing rivers, I like to use a bait dropper, and I use these Boppers by Korum. The reason I don't use a more traditional bait dropper, the round shaped ones, is in this flow they just get swept away really quickly, and it's difficult to get them on the bottom nice and neatly. And I don't need to clip up or do anything fancy in this swim because I'm only going to be fishing this glide, this inside edge, a couple of rod lengths out, so I can do it by eye and just drop maybe 6 or 7 of these bait droppers in. Now they're a really clever design. There's a pin in there. When it hits the bottom, the pin pushes up, releases the door and drops the bait. So the most important thing is if I put the first one in the swim, it's best to show you, load up the bait dropper. Now there is a little bit of a knack to this, a little underarm cast in this swim. Now you want to make sure you feel that down on a nice tight line to keep the bait dropper upright so the pin hits the bottom. And then once you feel it tap down on the bottom, and you reel it in, you can see the door is opened and drop that first dropper of bait. And you need some fairly serious kit to do this. You don't want to be losing any of these in the river. So I've got an Advanta rod and reel combo here. It's the Spod stroke marker rod with one of our marker Spod reels on there as well. And they actually come preloaded with some braid on there, which is 0.28 in diameter. So that'll break well over 30 pound, probably nearer 40. So some nice tough gear so you can get the bait out there without any mishaps. I'm probably going to put another 5 or 6 in there and then we'll get the fishing rods out.
Quite often the best anglers are the best baiters, and keeping a steady flow of bait going through the swim can make a massive difference to your catch rate during the session.
Before I get the fishing rods cast out, let's talk a little bit about the hardware and the setup that I'm using. Now, if I covered every aspect of barbel fishing from all different types of rivers, this video would probably be about an hour long. So I'll keep it kind of themed around the tidal Trent and the setup that I use on the tidal Trent. So the rod itself is quite a heavy rod. This is one of the Advanta twin tip rods. It comes with 2 top sections. There's a 2 1/4 pound test curve and there's a 2 3/4 pound test curve. And as the river's quite low and quite clear at the minute, I'm using the 2 1/4 and I'm casting 3 and 4 ounce leads with it. So that's absolutely perfect. And then on the rod, I've got a Shimano Baitrunner loaded up with some 15 pound line. This is a very snaggy river with some very big barbel in it. If I am lucky enough to hook a really big barbel, I want to see it go in my landing net. And the rig itself, it couldn't be simpler really. I like to use free running rigs for barbel. So I've got a nice run ring with my big Grippa lead, down to a buffer bead, and then my Hooklink. Now my Hooklinks are perhaps a little bit different to some other people's. I like to use a kind of combi link for barbel, and the reason I like to use that, I have 3 to 4 foot of quite tough fluorocarbon, so that'll be 15 or 20 pound fluorocarbon with a little figure of 8 loop at each end, and then I loop to loop a little braided section on the end of that bottom loop. And the reason I do this and that I don't just use straight mono or straight braid, I find with straight mono, quite often I've been cut off by big fish in the Trent. There's a lot of boulders out there, there's a lot of snags. I want something really tough. But then that little braided section at the end gives me the presentation. So if I just knot the snot at a 20-pound fluorocarbon, the presentation wouldn't be very good at all. It's too thick, but it's that thickness that you want to give you the abrasive resistance that you get from that fluorocarbon. And then, like I mentioned, I like to use big Grippa leads. I know lots of people feed a fish for barbel, but I prefer to use a big lead, and then I put a mesh PVA bag on the hook to add feed every time I cast out. The reason I don't really like the feeders, they're very clumsy to cast, and I find the shape of the feeders, they get caught in the snags quite a bit as well. So it's personal preference, but for me, big Grippa leads and PVA bags just seem a little bit more efficient on these big, powerful, snaggy rivers. So the light is now starting to dip a little bit. Being the river's so clear, I think if we're going to get a few bites on this trip, they're going to be in the evening, just in the dark. So I'm going to get both of these rods out, and fingers crossed we can catch a couple of barbel for the cameras.
I felt confident there was enough bait in the swim that I'd put out with the bait dropper, and now it was time to cast the fishing rods out with those little mesh PVA bags just to add a little bit more attraction around the hook bait. The evening passed and it was a quiet evening. It looked promising, but I still had the hours of darkness to look forward to.
Well, good morning. This is the morning after the night before. Typically, when the rivers are quite low and clear like they are on this session, bite time can definitely be late evening as we go into darkness. And that's exactly what happened last night. Not a lot happened in the evening, but as soon as it got dark, I had several nice barbel. I had one just under £10, and I had another one that was £11.5. So that brings me on to another really important aspect of barbel fishing, and that's conditions. So if you can time a trip after we've had some serious rainfall, barbel love it when the river colours up. And another thing that happens on the tidal, Trent, is the tides themselves. I definitely find just before and just after high tide is another good bite time. So if you can plan your trip, say you're going for an evening session on the tidal trend and you can get a nice high tide in the evening and fish evening into dark, that can be a brilliant time to go. So paying attention to the weather forecast and the tide times can get you a few bites. But I've got the rods back out this morning. I must admit I only managed to fish to about midnight and then tiredness got the better of me. The rods are back out. I've put a bit more bait out with the bait dropper, and hopefully we can get a couple of bites in the daytime before we have to head home.
My choice of hook baits are the 12mm Krill Active Boilies. In my opinion, these are perfect barbel baits. They're a small boilie wrapped in a soft paste to give them that extra attraction, and these are simply hair rigged on the end of those combi hook links.
Well, although I introduce bait into the swim using that bait dropper, I also regularly recast the rods about every 30 minutes, 45 minutes, similar to when you're feeder fishing, whereas a feeder will put bait through the swim. When I'm using these mesh bags, they do exactly the same job. So every time I have a recast, that's another mesh bag being dropped in the swim and another handful of bait.
Another great tip, you'll notice when I cast my rods out that I feel the lead down similar to a carp angler does, because there was a bit of weed in the swim, but so long as I felt that lead tap down on the bottom of the river, I knew that I'd landed on the clean gravel.
Now, although I have talked about the rods and reels earlier in this video, I want to stress the importance again of having either a Baitrunner type reel, or if you do use a non-Baitrunner, loosening the drag on the reel once you've cast out. You normally get one type of bite when you're barbel fishing, and it resembles your line being attached to the back of a Ferrari. So if you don't have a Baitrunner reel and you don't put that Baitrunner on, there's a high chance your rod and reel will end up in the river. Then you'll have to come and visit us at Angling Direct to replace it. Well, I think this is a good time to end the session. If you look behind me, there's some rather grey clouds and the wind is building. I'm sure there's going to be some fairly wild weather coming, which will be good for this river long term because it desperately needs some rain, hence most of our bites coming after darkness. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. It'll help you with your own barbel fishing. And don't forget, all the products that I've used are available at Angling Direct. And to make it even easier for you, I've put links to those products in the description so you can see exactly what I've used. But I'm going to get packed packed up and I'm going to get on the road before this weather comes, but when this rain does come, I'll definitely be back in a few weeks to try and catch a few more nice big barbel.